All right. Hey, everybody. You know how it is. It's like Sunday's coming,
Yeah.
and you're staring at your Bible, 1 John 5:14 to 15,
Right.
and it's like, okay, I got to preach on this. But you've heard it all, right? You've heard all the same old interpretations of the same old applications.
Mm.
You're like, there's got to be something more, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a familiar voice for so many of us. We've heard it we've probably even taught it ourselves, and yet sometimes it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we asked you guys to send us sermons on 1 John 5:14 to 15. Specifically sermons that went beyond the typical, the platitudes, the surface level stuff. We wanted to see how different pastors were really digging deep into this verse. And let me tell you, we got some good stuff.
Oh yeah, we were blown away by the creativity, the depth, the insights that these pastors brought to this seemingly simple passage.
So what I'm curious about is, did you notice like an overarching theme, like a thread that ran through all these different sermons?
Definitely. I'd say the biggest theme that emerged was this idea of confidence.
Confidence. Okay.
Yeah.
But like not the name it and claim it
Mhm.
kind of a confidence, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to move away from.
Exactly. It's a deeper, more nuanced kind of confidence. It's the confidence that comes from aligning our desires with God's will.
Hmm. Okay, see, that's where it gets interesting. Because 1 John 5:14 to 15 is often used to justify that whole God's my genie approach to prayer,
Right.
right? Like if I just pray hard enough and believe hard enough, then God has to give me whatever I want.
Right. And that's where I think a lot of us get tripped up. But these pastors are really pushing back against that. They're saying, no, it's not about demanding things from God. It's about understanding his will and aligning our hearts with it.
Okay, I'm liking this already. So how do they unpack that? How do they define God's will in a way that makes sense for everyday life?
One church that did a really good job of this was Trinity Church of Sunnyvale. They actually did a whole deep dive on the different types of God's will, sovereign, moral, permissive, and how understanding those distinctions is key to unlocking the true meaning of 1 John 5:14 to 15.
Okay, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hold up. You're throwing out some big theological terms here. Break it down for us. What are those different types of will, and how do they relate to this passage?
So sovereign will is God's ultimate plan, the big picture stuff that's completely outside of our control. Then you have moral will, which is God's revealed commands, like the 10 Commandments, ethical principles, that sort of thing. And then there's permissive will.
Permissive will. Okay, that's the one I'm the least familiar with.
Yeah, so permissive will is basically the stuff that God allows, even though it might not be his ideal. It might not be part of his perfect plan, but he allows it for our growth, for his purposes, or sometimes we don't even know why.
Okay, so how does that all tie into 1 John 5:14 to 15? Because the verse says, if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. So if God's will includes things that he merely permits, not necessarily things that he actively desires, doesn't that make the whole praying according to his will thing kind of pointless?
That's a great question. And it's one that Emerge 317.church tackled head on. They said it's not like a cosmic vending machine where we just punch in any request and automatically get it.
Oh, I like that. It's not a gimme, gimme, gimme situation.
Right. There's a condition there. The condition is that our requests must align with God's will. And that's not about figuring out some secret formula or decoding hidden messages. It's about cultivating a deep, intimate relationship with God.
So it's about knowing his heart, understanding his character, discerning his voice in our lives.
Exactly. It's about getting to a place where our desires are so aligned with his that we're not just asking for stuff, we're partnering with him and his work in the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this confidence theme comes into play.
Yeah.
It's not about being cocky or demanding. It's about that quiet assurance that comes from knowing you're in sync with God's heart.
Exactly. And that's where some of these sermon illustrations really shine. They take this abstract concept of alignment and make it tangible, relatable.
All right, hit me with those illustrations.
Yeah.
I love a good story.
Well, get ready for some drive-thru theology.
Wait, what? Drive-thru theology.
Yeah. Both Mount Olive Austin and Stone's Church use this analogy, but with slightly different spins.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So they use the drive-thru to illustrate the importance of understanding what's on God's menu. The Bible is like that menu. It reveals God's character, his promises, his desires.
So before we even start placing our orders through prayer, we need to know what's actually available, what God is willing to serve.
Exactly. Mount Olive Austin put it this way. You wouldn't walk into Chick-fil-A and demand a pizza, right? You look at the menu, you see what they offer, and then you place your order.
But I love that. It's such a simple, everyday image, but it really drives home the point.
And Stone's Church took it a step further. They talked about how sometimes you sail through the drive-thru and sometimes you're stuck in line forever.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
The point being, we can't always expect instant gratification from God. Sometimes the answer is wait, and that waiting can be part of God's refining process.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, because anyone who's ever, prayed for something big or led a congregation or even just like tried to figure out their own life knows that feeling of like, okay, God, I'm waiting. What's the deal?
Exactly, and it can be so tempting to just give up or to assume that God's not listening.
So what do these pastors say about those times when the answer is silence? Or even worse, like something we didn't want to hear?
A few of them tackled this head-on, Mount Olive. Austin's pastor had a really powerful message about reframing those silent moments. They argue that God's silence doesn't equal absence or rejection.
Yeah, that's so hard though, right? Because our human instinct is to think like, oh, if God's not answering me, it's because he's mad at me or he doesn't care.
Right. But they challenged that thinking. They said, no, those silent periods are actually an invitation to lean in, to deepen the relationship, to trust that God is working behind the scenes even when we can't see it.
Okay, I like that. It's not passive resignation. It's an active choice to trust.
And New Life Artesia's pastor offered some personal anecdotes that really brought this home. They shared stories about times when their prayers weren't answered in the way they'd hoped. But looking back, they could see how God was redirecting them, protecting them, or even just working on a different timeline.
I love those God's ways are higher than ours moments.
Right.
It reminds me of that time well, maybe that's a story for another day, but yeah, it's so true. We often can't see the bigger picture when we're in the middle of it.
Exactly. They even brought up Isaiah 55:8 to 9, that passage about how God's thoughts aren't our thoughts and his ways aren't our ways.
For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
Exactly. Sometimes what we think is best for us isn't actually what God has in mind.
Okay, but I got to push back a little here.
Mm.
Because while I appreciate the big picture perspective, there's still that human part of me that craves those specific answers, those tangible breakthroughs. Did any of these pastors address that tension?
Absolutely. And this is where the sermons got really personal, really vulnerable. Trinity Church of Sunnyvale's pastor shared a story about a guy who felt called to take a significant pay cut to pursue a new opportunity.
Whoa, a pay cut. That's a big leap of faith.
It was. And it went against all conventional wisdom, but he felt like God was leading him to do it. So he took the pay cut, trusting that it was aligned with God's will.
What happened?
Well, a few years later, his company got acquired, and he ended up in a better financial position than he ever could have imagined.
No way. Talk about a plot twist.
It's like God was saying, trust me, I've got a plan for you, even if it doesn't make sense right now.
That's incredible. It's like sometimes we have to let go of our own limited perspective and just surrender to God's grand design.
Exactly. And that surrender, that trust, is what unlocks the confidence that 1 John 5:14 to 15 talks about. It's not about arrogance or presumption. It's about that deep-seated assurance that comes from knowing we're walking in step with God.
It's interesting you mentioned sacrifice, because one theme that I noticed popping up in several of these sermons was the idea that prayer isn't just about asking for things. It's about maintaining a posture of gratitude and trust.
Yes, several of the pastors emphasize this. Hagen Lister used a great analogy. He compared prayer to building a house. It's not just about laying the foundation. It's about the ongoing maintenance, the upkeep, the repairs, making sure that the house stays strong and functional.
I like that. So it's not just about the initial ask. It's about consistently showing up, expressing gratitude for what God has already done, and trusting him for what's to come, even when we're in those in-between seasons of waiting.
And that consistent practice, that discipline of prayer, helps cultivate that deep-seated confidence we were talking about earlier.
It's like we're building spiritual muscle memory. The more we practice aligning our hearts with God's will, the easier it becomes to discern his voice and trust his leading, even when things get tough.
Listening to you talk about this, I'm reminded of a story from my own.
Well, hold on. Are you about to get personal with us?
Yeah.
Because I am here for it.
Well, let's just say I've had my own share of wrestling with this verse. There was a time when I was facing a major decision and I felt completely stuck. I prayed and prayed, but I just couldn't seem to get any clarity,
Oh, yeah. It's like being in a spiritual fog.
Yeah.
You can't see which way to go.
Exactly. And I was getting frustrated. I felt like I was doing everything right, praying, reading scripture, seeking wise counsel, but I still felt lost.
So what shifted? How'd you get out of that fog?
It was actually a sermon on 1 John 5:14 to 15 that finally broke through. The pastor was talking about how sometimes the answer isn't a flashing neon sign, It's a gentle whisper.
Mhm.
And it's not always about getting a specific directive. It's about aligning our hearts with God's will so completely that we're willing to trust him, even when we don't understand.
Oh, that's so good. It takes the pressure off of having to figure everything out on our own.
Right, exactly. It's about surrender.
Surrendering to God's wisdom, even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain.
And that's exactly what I did. I finally let go of my need to control the outcome, and I just said, God, I trust you. Show me what you want me to do, and I'll do it.
Wow.
And you know what? The clarity came, not all at once, but gradually as I continued to seek him and trust his leading.
Man, that is such a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important part of prayer is simply saying, yes, Lord.
Yes, surrendering our will to his.
Okay, so we've talked about confidence alignment with God's will, the importance of surrender. What else can we glean from these sermons to help our listeners craft impactful messages on this verse?
One thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on the relational aspect of prayer.
Okay.
It's not just about presenting our request to a distant deity. It's about cultivating an intimate, ongoing conversation with a loving Father.
So it's less about dear God and more about hey, Dad.
Right. It's about that heart-to-heart connection.
Yeah,
And that's where those secular illustrations can be so powerful because they help bridge the gap between these theological concepts and everyday experience. Like, remember that Chick-fil-A drive-thru analogy?
oh yeah. The idea that we need to know what's on God's menu before we start placing our orders.
Exactly. It's such a great way to make this whole idea of praying according to God's will more accessible and relatable.
Totally. And it's a good reminder that prayer isn't about manipulating God or trying to get him to do our bidding. It's about aligning our desires with his, seeking his heart, growing in our understanding of who he is and what he wants for us.
And you know, when we approach prayer from that perspective, it changes everything. It's no longer about getting what we want. It's about becoming who God created us to be.
It's about transformation, not
Yeah.
transaction.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message to share with our congregations because ultimately that's what we all long for, to experience that deep, abiding connection with God that changes us from the inside out.
So for all you pastors and Bible study leaders out there, I hope this deep dive is giving you some fresh fodder for your next sermon or study session. We've explored the nuances of God's will, the importance of surrender, and trust the power of relational prayer, and so much more.
And as you prepare to share this verse with your listeners, remember, it's not just about conveying information. It's about inviting them into a deeper experience of God's love and grace.
Beautifully said. Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, and may your sermons be filled with fresh insights and spirit-led inspiration